This is the Other Side of Breakthrough News.
And welcome back to the Other Side podcast here on Breakthrough News. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always. Honored to be here as always alongside Manolo de los Santos, Becker. How y'all feeling today?
Happy to join the conversation.
We're all fully vaccinated.
We
are. I don't know if people can see we're 1 or 2 feet closer to one another than we would be before.
That's actually true. But when you have the vaccine, you can do new things. So maybe that's a message to the people, our patrons. If perhaps you're questioning, know that the Other Side team has taken it. We are encouraging you to also get
We strongly
vaccinated.
encourage it.
Indeed. Public health, paramount here at Breakthrough News. Well, as always, gentlemen, when we start this show, I mean, there are a million things that we could talk about. The world is on fire, as always. But perhaps the most logical place to start, given what we just said, is this issue around not just vaccines in particular, but the global production of vaccines, the relaxation of IP waivers around World Trade Organization. I'm sure most of the people who are watching this will have known this. The United States came out, surprisingly to many, backed a proposal by India and South Africa and 100 other countries to temporarily relax an emergency measure, the IP restrictions around COVID-19 vaccinations.
Intellectual property. Yes.
Intellectual property, excuse me, the so-called TRIPS waiver. I can't remember the exact acronym there, but very unexpected from the United States in a lot of ways. And of course, this has become a huge issue. One thing I'll say before I ask you some of your thoughts, 70% of people in G7 countries, on the same day the US made the announcement, 70% of people in G7 countries said that they wanted to see this kind of a relaxation of waivers. So, I mean, in addition to those 100 countries, really the masses of people in the quote unquote first world, I mean, the whole world saying this is something that must happen. We have to jailbreak these patents, as it were. And I mean, I think, Manolo, obviously, there's a lot that could be said. You know, there's a lot that could be raised with this. But it does seem like it's important to start with the fact that this was not something that necessarily was guaranteed to happen or slated to happen, but because of worldwide outcry, it did happen.
I mean, I am not one to, we can't take away victories from the people. I mean, this was definitely the result of not just the outcry, but the actual push from, many organizations and people's movements around the world, demanding this not of the United States only, but also of the European Union and other, the top powers of the world as they be. I do think, though, that, the difficulties or the ironies of this moment is that, sadly, the White House making this sort of statement is not sufficient to actually make this a reality. In part because of the role that private corporations continue to hold in American society, and that, they now claim their independence from the U.S. government and being able to make any real decisions in this. They claim that, the waiver wouldn't actually help out with vaccine rollout. But I also felt that the statement from the White House was sort of making the argument that, well, we're making this decision, or we're supporting this decision from the White House, but ultimately it's not on us as the U.S., as the major superpower on the planet, to really make the decision. We leave it up to our partners in Europe to decide, which really leaves the space that when the discussion does take place, the U.S. can wash his hands and leave it up to the Europeans to kill this.
When I step back from it, I'm like, it's just amazing that this was such a struggle to begin with. I mean, there's been so much sanctimonious discussion about we're all in this together, we're an interdependent world, we're a global economy, a global community, the old borders don't matter anymore. But if you go to any of these big international conventions, you have like 1,000 discussions like this. It's certainly what Biden and the others would say. But then when it comes to the pandemic, the ultimate global phenomenon, it's like every country for themselves, hoarding, profit, and it's a big struggle to do the thing that's obviously in the interest of the whole world. Right. I mean, is just to, maybe we could suspend the profit motive for a little while so we could, save humanity. And instead it requires a big struggle. And as you're saying, it's still not even, victory is not certain. And it reminds me even of what we've experienced in this country, where every government leader basically passes the buck on to someone else. It would be like, well, we did this, but the state didn't order the right size mask. And then the mayor says, well, if the state would have just released a certain amount to us and this, and while the people are still waiting for the thing that they desperately need, and every political leader points their finger at someone else. And unfortunately, it's like now we've replicated that on a global scale.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, it speaks to me to the role of the United States still. I mean, the issue that both of you have raised in terms of, this being important but not sufficient. The United States, that many people don't know this, is the key producer of at least a couple important elements in the vaccine supply chain. This was, of course, the issue in India, where they were trying to ramp it up. I mean, from cellular material to even something, I've just learned this myself, called bioreactor bags. Never heard of them before myself, but an important new technology.
Oh, you don't know about bioreactor bags?
Well,
what?
What can I say? Unlike some, I'm not that scientific, but it's an important new technology that's like big for growing cell culture and that you really have to have in modern vaccine production. So it's this interesting piece too, because it speaks to the interest of the profit motive and how it works. Because the reason there's a shortage is because the U.S. government, using the Defense Production Act, spent a huge amount of money to pay companies that create these various things up and down the supply chain to scale up their production in order to help the United States. But the United States doesn't need all of the supply that actually can even be produced. And so, in fact, if I'm in Iowa or whatever making bioreactor bags and I have 1,000 and they're just going to go into some warehouse and sit there for forever and a day, I can't send them to India where they're actually going to use them without special permission from the U.S. government. So, you look at South Korea, for instance, it said on Monday, we're prepared to try to turn the whole country into a major factory for the world to build more vaccines. But if they try to scale up and the U.S. doesn't address this issue, there'll be a huge bottleneck in supply and we'll still be in a tricky situation.
I mean, but what I find remarkable in all this is that the situation arises in part because it's been U.S. allies who have been requesting for help from the U.S. It's not Cuba and China. It's not Vietnam asking for help. It's India who actually, almost created a war situation with China over its support for the U.S. I mean, it's countries that in one way or another have sort of bent backwards to meet the U.S.'s defense needs in Asia, who have in many ways basically sacrificed their own people for U.S., policy priorities. And now, that they're left alone actually sends a really strong message to the world community. Even if you stand with the U.S., even if you go to all the lengths to basically fulfill all the U.S.'s needs and promises, there's nothing in return for you. Yeah. The U.S. actually, as a major superpower, is never really willing to save humanity. Whatever aura they had since World War II, in this sense, whatever American dream could have existed, I think is sort of deteriorating before our eyes.
And it's political, but it's also about the rule of private property. I mean, Pfizer still had to get their hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in profits before this happened. I mean, they could have done this many, many months ago, and it probably would have saved many thousands of lives if they had all the problems that you're raising, Eugene. Those are the problems that should have been discussed and figured out. The moment that the vaccine was there, they had all that time to prepare for how are we going to then think about distribution and how are we going to think about the supply chain. And they didn't do it. And it's basically because they left everything in the hands of private companies. And part of their contracts with those private companies was that they weren't going to, nullify their intellectual property.
Even though all the it was public funding.
It was public funding that allowed those private corporations to make that money. It reminds me even of the eviction moratorium. I mean, it seems like a totally separate thing, but it's like the government through the CDC says we're going to mandate a moratorium on all evictions. But then at the end of the day, the state governments, the local governments allowed landlords to do whatever. The landlords used the courts to basically slow it down. It still hasn't really been enforced. It's Swiss cheese. And in many states in the country, people are being evicted while the government at the federal level says, look, we've done the right thing. We're standing on your side. It creates this almost like Alice in Wonderland symbolic law territory where you feel like something's happening, but then when you look around, the opposite.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's important on so many levels, but it just shows how this crisis is not going to abate. I mean, even though positive things are happening in a number of different places, a number of different countries, of course, big steps forward with the Cuban vaccine and other pieces like that, the role of the US, the UK, the EU in particular, in league with big pharmaceutical companies and big medical companies is the biggest stumbling block to addressing the COVID-19 pandemic in a way that is logical. So I hate to say that we'll be back on the other side next month talking again about it, but it really does speak to, I think, how central capitalism is as a stumbling block to real progress in terms of what can happen, not just with the COVID-19 pandemic, but in the world itself. And I think it leads to, one final speculative question that we'll have to keep raising and keep asking is, if this thing does get curtailed, what's the impact? I mean, we know the end of World War II, the anti-colonial upsurge, the end of World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution and the tide of revolution all around the world. I mean, obviously this is not like a war in that sense, but it does feel like it shaped the consciousness of people in a warlike way. And I think it's an open question to what that is going to mean for what the future can and will be.
I mean, it's a perfect transition to the speech that Joe Biden gave just last week when he gave a speech that was honestly full of reforms that we never. I don't think when Biden announced he was going to run for president before the pandemic.
Plan, you're saying?
Huh?
The American Family Plan.
The American Family Plan. There's stuff about child care and parental leave and all the benefits, the tax benefits that are built in for working class parents, even the infrastructure. I mean, they always talk about infrastructure, but now it seems they've actually introduced a real plan. That Biden's program is very different today than when he announced his campaign.
Completely.
Before the pandemic. And I think it speaks to the same thing, that the pandemic has so destabilized the global economic and political situation, plus the social explosion, which was the revolt against racism last summer, which, could come back at any moment.
Yeah.
And I think people like Biden and the smart people around him know that at any moment, that if there's ever a moment to try to actually pass some reforms, this would be it, because they're sitting on a powder keg in the US and around the world. And they're also thinking, as Biden said in his speech like 1,000 times, about the rise of China. And how is the rise of China, the way it's reacted to the vaccine, the way it's promoting technology, infrastructure, it's treating the vaccine as a global good. All these things impact the standing of the United States in the world. And if the United States just keeps with the status quo, where it's sort of private profit runs everything, we give nothing to the people, good luck, the U.S. will inevitably be eclipsed.
Yeah.
And so I think that this sort of global competition, plus the pandemic, plus the social explosion, it's created this very interesting political moment that we're in that I don't think anyone could have really anticipated.
I mean, I know the three of us fiercely critiqued Biden's campaign.
And still will.
And we still will. But I do think it's important to analyze the conjuncture that created this moment. I think you rightly point out to the fact that, Biden came into the White House in a moment in which this country's social fabric is still falling apart. I mean, it is still today. Mm-hmm. I mean, we saw, during when the verdict for the Derek Chauvin trial was about to come, there was a level of tension that was not just felt on the streets, but was definitely being felt in the ruling class circles of the United States. Mm-hmm. That any slight, turn could possibly fire this country up in the same ways that we felt last summer.
Yeah.
And we're going back into the summer now. There's still the threat that, there could be mass mobilizations against the U.S. government and against police brutality and against all the different forms of exploitation that exist in this country. But I would say that, that there's a historical precedent for what Biden is doing.
Yeah.
In a sense, we saw this during the 30s when President Roosevelt had to agree to a New Deal program in order to deal with the growing class struggles in the country. We saw this during the Lyndon B. Johnson administration. The Civil Rights Act and a series of other social programs of the era were not the result of Johnson being a good president. In fact, it was because he had to respond to the growing struggles in the country. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, both Roosevelt and Johnson also had to respond to a more difficult international environment. I mean, we can't forget that while Johnson was passing Civil Rights Acts, they were also invading the Dominican Republic and preparing the ground for growing, U.S. participation in the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
So, in a sense, Biden is smart enough to have read history is acting appropriately to basically stave off what could possibly be a growing movement of poor and working people in this country against capitalism.
No, I think that's an important point. And even listening to the American family plan concept, and as you were saying, Ben, the contrast with China, I mean, it just made me think so much of the Republican rhetoric, which of course is so couched in racism, but around sort of the decline of America, that it's like a quote unquote third world country, a quote unquote banana republic. And we know that that is a ridiculous set of loaded terms, but I think it does speak to the fact that, in the context of what is obviously a terminal, or we'll see if it's terminal, but a serious secular crisis in capitalism, where since 2000, the only way the economy can even operate is these multi-trillion-dollar interventions into the capitalist markets by the state, that the race to the bottom, the erosion of people's living standards, is having a huge impact on the consciousness of people thinking that America is the best country. And looking at the rising standard of living of China over the past 30 years and the declining standard of living in the United States, I mean, I was viewing so much of that through that same lens of like, they are really trying to combat the idea that people's futures are going to be worse than their past in terms of the things that they're offered. And it's an interesting piece about how U.S. sort of, social programs or anything positive for the working class is so driven by this image of imperial greatness, but how weak and how fragile that can really be, and how weak and fragile it continues to be. Because despite the fact I think this plan has many good things, I think they primarily are not the type of things that are going to change this sort of broader economic setup. And I think it could turn into an even deeper conflict, because you see with the Republicans and a handful of Democrats who are just in I don't even know it's almost a homicidal mentality, who are determined to block even the slightest change in apparently anything in America. It just seems 100% rooted. I remember when Wall Street was saying the best outcome for them was a Republican Senate, a Democratic House, and a Democratic president, because then nothing could happen. And you just think like the billionaires who made $1.3 trillion during the pandemic alone last year don't want there to be any more social obligations on them, no matter how little they lose from it, no matter how little it changes. I mean, Biden was right in a way. This would not fundamentally change the lives of billionaires, even though it would fundamentally change the lives of the 30 million people who don't have one paid sick day. But for them, just the idea that the 67% of low-wage workers that don't have access to one paid sick day could, with their money, is like they would rather destroy the entire country and hundreds of millions of people's lives. It's quite a statement.
There's a whole literature about what makes America exceptional, from a left-wing literature. And people say, why wasn't socialism ever so big here? And what is it about the working class here? And the big analysis of the working class. But there really needs to be a study of the capitalist class in America. What is exceptional about them? I mean, what you're laying out there. This is a country awash in money, just swimming in it. Some of them probably literally swim in money.
Scrooge McDuck or whatever.
Yeah. But it would not be hard to pass these things. And yet it is going to be hard to pass these things. And it's actually going to rely on the level of struggle in the streets of this country to actually make the reforms that have been laid out real. Because I don't think that's the thing where we can't trust Joe Biden or anyone who's putting it forward to actually go toe-to-toe with those people in a really vicious struggle to win some reforms. And I think that's where the civil rights movement has to be our guiding light. Because, I don't know if people have read this book by Mary Dudziak, Cold War Civil Rights. And it's a really interesting book. She makes the argument, and of course, the book has its critics, but she makes the argument that there was already a growing awareness within the U.S. ruling class, based on the Cold War context, that something had to be done about Jim Crow. And so, for instance, Brown versus Board of Education, which comes before the Montgomery struggle, is a part of the Supreme Court recognizing that we have to send a different message to the world. They didn't actually want to desegregate the schools, but they at least wanted to send a different message to the world. But then it took a huge struggle to actually desegregate anything. So the government can do certain things based on their positioning in the world environment, but that can be hollow unless there's a real struggle to push it over. And she makes the argument too, which I think is worth us thinking about. The Cold War opened opportunities for the civil rights movement, but it also constrained the civil rights movement in a way, because it meant that the activists and organizers and leaders, even if they had an affinity to socialist and left-wing ideas, knew that if they were to touch those ideas, it would sort of invalidate their movement. So it both opened it and it constrained it politically. So now we're in somewhat similar situation.
But very different.
But very different. And I think that the socialism is already out there, the different model. I don't think they can put that back away.
I mean, a so-called socialist almost became the Democrat candidate. Whatever we think about it,
Yeah.
I
Right.
mean, that's big in America.
Right. And but I do think it means we also have to deal with the reality that this sort of progressive reforms that are being advanced are also being advanced in an anti-China package. Yeah. So we both have to fight for that and not concede to the sort of imperialist rhetoric.
But I think, to me, the important difference of the moment is that we could be building towards, I don't think we're there yet, but we could be building towards the actual confluence, the coming together of 140 million poor and dispossessed people in this country, working people who are a paycheck away from homelessness, from hunger and deprivation, with the growing socialist consciousness among young people in this country today. I mean, that could be an explosive combination of people in movement, in mobilization, understanding, the lessons of the last Red Summer. That this government only understands the language of force, the language of movement, the language of confrontation, in fact. So I actually think, we're in a much better place to go beyond even, because I think some folks will sort of create this moment in which it's either, you have to thank Biden for being so good and giving us these reforms, or, completely attacking Biden and saying, this is rubbish. No, this is not rubbish. This is not a moment we can just push to the side and say, oh, it's not important, or these are only reformist struggle. This is a moment where we say, we have to dig in our heels with working people in this country and conscious young people who say, we need a different world. And fighting for that different world will actually mean not just taking up the question of China, but saying, in reality, no real transformation of lives can happen in the United States if the United States does not change its policy, not just towards China, but towards the people of the Philippines, towards the people of Latin America, towards people in Africa. I mean, everywhere we see the anti-China rhetoric of the Biden administration is creating the basis for them to increase their role in Africa. We saw AFRICOM increasing its budget to basically engage in more, building more military bases on the continent. We see their increased, belligerence in Latin America, their increased belligerence against Venezuela. So to me, this is just a great opening for a new stage and struggle for the American people.
Yeah, I think that's 100% true. I mean, you mentioned the Philippines. This is a hard pivot, but I do want to give a shout out to the community pantry movement in the Philippines that I hope people check out. This massive movement that's sweeping the country. It's, bring something, take something. And it's about food. And so if you have some food to give, bring it. If you need the food to eat, you just take it. It's not a market. It's not a payment. And of course, this massive movement has deeply embarrassed the fascistic government of Duterte. So they're now trying to mark them all as communists, so-called red tagging, which means that they'll be marked for death, marked for assassination. But it's an amazing movement happening in the Philippines, the community pantry movement that I hope people check out. But I mean, it does bring us to, I think, a couple crossroads. And I mean, especially on the issue of China. I mean, we mentioned this earlier, the India-China connection vis-a-vis the vaccines. But I mean, seeing the Indian regional elections recently, especially the win for the left, LDF for sure, in Kerala state, which is I think, I don't want to say it's one of the more unknown. I think it's actually become more known. But I think one of the more interesting examples of the difference between sort of a socialist consciousness, even in a capitalist society, and a capitalist sort of profit-first consciousness, and how these things are addressed in terms of crises, the pandemic, and elsewhere, and a hopeful story in many ways about what's possible, even in very difficult conditions. And I think in India, obviously, the conditions are very tricky in terms of the power of the right wing and so on and so forth. So I don't know if anyone wants to comment on that, but it's certainly notable.
Sure. Well, I mean, Kerala is a state of, I think, 34 million or something
35 million.
35 million. So it's bigger than Venezuela.
Yeah.
It's bigger than Chile, I think, and Peru. And I mean, it's a Kerala would be a big country. And
a big economy.
And a big economy. And the victory of
35 million people, is that about side California in terms of people, right? There's a little bit more than that. But just to give people a sense.
In other words, if the Communist Party were to win an election in a country of that size, it would be big news.
Yeah.
But because it's a state, it's not as big news.
One of the smaller states of India.
It's right. But, it's obviously significant because the Communist Party of India Marxist, which is the anchor of the LDF, is the
Left Democratic Front.
The Left Democratic Front. It's the first time that an incumbent party has won re-election in that state, which is always, flipped between the left and the center right, and so it's a big statement about how the left has governed through multiple crises, through natural disasters as well as the pandemic. It's been really the complete opposite of how the Modi government has operated. And it really shows, and it's been premised on people's participation. It's not just that they have good governance, but they've actually activated all these networks, health networks, social workers, students, to everyone to sort of act as one in defense of the community. And they won a resounding victory. Well, not a narrow victory, a resounding victory. The BJP, Modi's party, lost their one seat in the state legislature, and they took many other losses across the country this past weekend when the results came in. So I think it's really important that we continue to uphold that this sort of private property, profit-centered model is not the only model operating in the world. There are other models, and they work, and it shows that they work, and it should give us some hope about the whole world struggle, I think.
No, it gives us tremendous hope. I mean, to think of how small Kerala, small in the Indian context again, is providing oxygen for other states in India.
Right.
Kerala is the state that's pushing for vaccines to be made free and accessible to all people in India. Kerala, in many ways, is the state that said, we won't reject migrants.
Right.
We will actually provide support, financial support for migrant workers in the midst of this pandemic. And, they have these sort of iconic leaders.
Yes.
Like the Chief Minister Pinarayi, they have the Corona Slayer,
Yes.
The Health Minister KK, who, have this level of dialogue with society, with the people. Like you said, it's not a question of distributing resources. It's not a question of giving everyone a monthly check, but it's actually about how do you build daily solutions to our problems with the people. And I think Kerala, hopefully what we see in Kerala will hopefully be a sign of the revival of the left movements across India.
And with limited resources. I mean, many people don't know this, but there are many restrictions on state governments in India over what they can really control. So all the great things that people have seen, from public housing to healthcare to education, now they're going to give free broadband internet to every single person to try to drive forward employment and internet information technology. All of that has been done on what, from a sort of governmental perspective, would be a shoestring budget. They've had to come up with all sorts of creative schemes in which to raise money because they're always being, austerityized by the center and the BJP that does not want them to succeed. So I think that's also an important lesson where because of uneven and combined development, right? We're in a position where oftentimes the left can do better in smaller places, or not necessarily smaller places, but not whole countries. What does it mean to operate in a principled fashion there? And there are other good experiments and things we can talk about around the world, but I think that is so deeply notable. And one thing I'll just say really quickly that I think speaks to the image of it, the chief minister, when he gives the first press conference, were you about to say this?
No, go ahead.
Okay, the first press conference after they win. I mean, I think anyone anywhere knows anytime you see a politician's press conference, it's all self-congratulatory after the election. He actually started by reporting on the coronavirus crisis, where are we at, where we stand, the same that he's always been doing, and then goes on to thank people for the election victory, but to say we're only going to become more humble, and that this actually means we have to work harder, not more. And it just, almost nowhere else in the world do you see that kind of spirit after a resounding election victory, which, rightfully could have been celebrated right at the top there. So it's just, on so many levels, very interesting.
And, people should definitely read the Tricontinental newsletter,
Yes.
which has a lot of—
Tricontinental Institute for Social Research.
Yes, which has a lot about this. And, one thing that Vijay Prashad, the editor, says is that the government there has exuded calm throughout the crisis, never downplaying where they're at, never saying, okay, it's all good, like not that kind of calm. But it's been calm, serious, taking the constituency seriously, speaking in plain but scientific terms, not being sensationalistic, whereas the Modi government has been all over the place talking about how, it's not a big deal, kind of Trump-like, and then also using these side issues of religious polarization to try to scapegoat people, to distract people, and that has a big public health impact too. And instead, the government in Kerala, and I think we really shouldn't underplay this, has said we are not going to enforce these like the Citizenship Act, which tries to basically register Muslims as second-class citizens and so forth. And they're saying we're going to reject polarization. This is a time to come together. Being able to push back on that sort of right-wing politics is a part of their public health success. I did want to read from the newsletter the final quote of the health minister.
This is very good.
Who explains sort of the internationalism. I won't preface it too much.
That's okay.
She said, I think there are two major lessons from this pandemic. One, that the country needs proper planning and decentralized implementation mechanisms to improve our health system. And two, there can be no delay in enhancing public investment in healthcare. We spend just 1% of our GDP on the health sector. It should be increased to at least 10%. Countries like Cuba invest much more in healthcare. Cuba's family doctors influenced me when we started the family health centers here in Kerala. Healthcare should be universal with some regulations at the tertiary. Skip ahead. Cuba has achieved a lot because of their centralized planning and decentralized implementation. Their system of healthcare is people-centric and patient-centric. Their egalitarian concept and decentralization can be emulated here. Just another example of how little Cuba, the island in the Western Hemisphere, continues to have an impact on people's well-being all over the world. At the Kerala celebration rallies, there are Che flags everywhere. So I love that.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's important and it's certainly good. Please, you were going to...
No.
Oh, I thought you had one more.
No, I just think it means everyone should read the Tricontinental newsletter every Thursday.
They should. And if they want to hear some of those things in video form, they can go to People's Dispatch, where Subin, our friend Subin, good friend of Breakthrough News, did a great video with People's Dispatch, laying out some of that as well about the red wave in Kerala, the harvesting of saffron, if you will. That's my new favorite phrase. Saw a great poster with that. Anyway, long story short, talking about pushing back against the right wing, Colombia. I mean, Colombia I don't want to say unbelievable because I'm not surprised. It's a country that's been in resistance for many years, but really an astounding state of resistance. I think many people did not see this coming. Oppression breeds resistance, as we know. I think now over a week, strikes, protests, demonstrations, repression. I mean, it just seems the social explosion in Latin America continuing.
I mean, I would say that this is not strange. This did not surprise the Colombian people. I mean, while this particular moment of the struggle is sort of focused and geared towards the tax reforms that, would have imposed tremendous taxes on working people in Colombia, this is only one more outbreak in a long history of social mobilizations and protests by the Colombian people. I mean, the Colombian people face, on one hand, the incredible violence from the state that has killed hundreds of social leaders, movement people in the last few years. We have the economic violence of a state that, does not allow the Colombian people to, advance or grow or actually to live any life with dignity in many senses. There are many struggles that are happening in the countryside because peasants continue to fight for the right, not just to grow their products, but to be able to sell them for fair prices, without being, corrupted and dealt, bad deals by the government and corporations. So there's a series of struggles that are happening in Colombia to say that this is not random. This is not a coincidence. It's not a last minute thing that popped off, but rather this is a continuing, motif in the history of Colombia.
Look at the audacity of the Duque government in the middle of a pandemic and actually using the pandemic as the excuse to say we're going to increase taxes on milk and eggs and gasoline, all the things that like the working class needs.
$6.5 billion worth of taxes.
And we're going to reduce taxes on corporations. This is to raise money for the so-called...
Allegedly to improve people's lives.
Yeah, I mean, you can only have that kind of program at this moment if you have a certain degree of military hegemony, political hegemony, at least that's the way you feel, with the U.S. behind you especially, that like you can just do whatever. And I think what he's learning is that you can't just do whatever, that the Colombian working class, the Afro-Colombian communities, the poor communities, I mean, they're like in full-scale rebellion now. And they're using so much force, so much violence. It was very frustrating to watch the Spanish language media in the United States this past week, where it's like in Colombia, I'm looking at Twitter and they're shooting people from helicopters. I saw a woman on a video crying because like children or teenagers have been burned, and like
Police cars running over
police
people.
cars running
Young
over
man in
people,
Cali
and
with
it's
a
like
drive-by on the guy.
and it's like not even a big story. And of course, I mean, I hate to always draw this comparison, but in Venezuela, you know, the moment that any tear gas enters the atmosphere, it's
Someone
like
gets a hangnail.
yeah, it's like
world
it's
news.
it's world news and front page thing, and the regime must go. That's the language. And there's nothing like that when the country right next door is really having a much more severe police reaction to this movement, is killing a lot more people, is always killing people in Colombia, and it's just pure impunity on the international level.
But you know, the thing is, in a sense, Colombia can do this because it does know that it has support from the U.S.
Yeah.
In fact, it knows that it has 8 military bases of the United States on its soil that can, you know, support militarily in its response. In fact, it knows that the units it sent out to repress the protests, the ESMAD, are actually trained fully by different agencies of the United States, ranging from the DEA to ICE to the U.S. military itself. It knows as well that the Biden administration, just like the Trump administration would have if this had occurred then, will never, ever actually go against its partners in Colombia. Because Colombia is not just their ally. It's the strategic partner against any left-wing project in the region. In fact, it's so weird that just yesterday, the godfather of all this sort of madness in Colombia, Álvaro Uribe, the former president, and who handpicked his successor, Duque at this moment, was receiving an award at NYU for allowing Colombia to be a sustainable country.
Wow.
Showing the capacity to lead, a successful development of the Colombian people.
It's insulting. It's like, yeah, we're both speechless here. I mean,
no, I know.
And if you see what the Biden administration's very quip and short statement in a press conference was just a day or two ago, it was like, we regret, we're sad to see that there has been some violence, but we also call on protesters not to be violent.
Right.
Classic.
As if you could equate the two.
Right.
I remember when, there is a solidarity movement in the United States with the Colombian left, and I hope that we can help revive it, because it's so important that speeches like that or whatever awards like they have to be interrupted. I mean, we have to break through the sort of the veneer of this normalization of Uribe and Uribismo and the right wing. I mean, they have to be confronted when they go around the world getting these awards. And I've been part of some actions here in New York that were very testy, because there's a lot of right wing sort of in the immigrant community, and there's that sort of culture that like leftists deserve to die, that they import, that they bring with them, because that's the culture in a lot of Colombia. And so it's going to be an intense struggle, but it has to be fought, because ultimately those awards that he's getting around the world is helping perpetuate that kind of violence in their own country.
No, yeah. I mean, as is the greenwashing. I mean, the so-called center and the Green Party in Colombia has played a huge role in essentially just using quote-unquote environmentalism to create a hedge that has allowed the right-wing forces in Colombia to continue to practice hegemony on the electoral front. Now, we'll see in the next elections if that happens. I think another aspect of this is we've seen that Gustavo Petro, as at least a potential candidate, as a part of what is now a unified list of many left-wing parties, has surged in the polls. So, I mean, obviously this is Colombia, so there's no guarantees one way or the other, even if people do vote you in. But nevertheless, I think that is also indicative of the broader mood that we're seeing. And speaking of elections and indicative of broader moves in the right wing, Peru, which has also seen the Pedro Castillo, the at least stated left-wing candidate, far, far ahead of Keiko Fujimori, who is you couldn't be any more far right than that. And she's been openly defending her father, Alberto Fujimori's dictatorship in the 1990s, where, I think it was 250,000 peasant women were forcibly sterilized, tens of thousands of people were murdered, disappearances were completely rampant, and complete and total neoliberalism was brought into the country in a catastrophe. No surprise people don't want to go back to that. But relatively unknown person, sort of emerges kind of out of the ether there. Now there's quite a bit of left unity. Yesterday or the day before we recorded this, there was a press conference with Veronica Mendoza, the other left-wing candidate, that they were coming together and bringing it together. And it has a similar feeling to me, whatever the outcome, obviously not whatever the outcome, but not to make huge statements, but it does have a feeling to me like that 1998 election in Venezuela, like the first election of Evo in Bolivia, like perhaps we'll see the forced transformation election in Mexico, where it feels like it could be a turning point for the country away from this just extreme, hardcore, neoliberal, fascistic right atmosphere.
Yeah, I mean, I think, now whatever the outcome, we would hope for victory for the left in Peru, because it would actually create open new spaces for people's movements and the left to grow on the continent, without a doubt. But even if they don't win, this will have been a huge step forward for the movements in Peru, who have historically, faced many sectarian issues, been divided on many other issues, and, that there was a serious urban-rural divide in the left. In a sense, Pedro Castillo...
That's about 500 years old, that one.
Yes, that's a 500-year-old struggle, the left was never able to figure that one out. But I think the more important element of this is that this has demonstrated the maturity and the growth of the rural movement, of the peasant movements in Peru, of the indigenous movements coming together as a social force to actually push back against what they know would be ultimately the death of the country. Because to go back to a Fujimori government, whether it's Alberto or Keiko as the first name, would mean more than just neoliberalism. I mean, it would mean, because what they've been advocating in this campaign is essentially the government should take a complete step back, should take no responsibility for the well-being of the people. I mean, as Pedro is actually pushing that, Pedro is, like, funny enough, or announced in the campaign debate that he had already negotiated with the Russians to bring in vaccines, to bring 28 million vaccines only a few weeks later after their victory.
Hit the ground running.
While Keiko has said, well, that's not really our responsibility.
Wow.
And why would we get vaccines from the Russians? Those vaccines are not tested enough. So I think the Peruvian electorate will really have to decide. I mean, either we vote for our lives, which happens to be with a left project, or we vote for going back into history.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be very interesting. And like I said at the start of this, I mean, the world really is on fire. I mean, we're sitting on a powder keg of so many social, environmental, cultural issues that can't really be resolved inside of the framework of this current world capitalist imperialist setup. And that what happens after that, we don't know. But I think it certainly does mean that the resistance that we've seen, the ups and downs, the rapid and wild swings of politics both ways all around the world is going to continue, because it's not just about personalities or whatever. And this is, of course, the liberal discourse, right? That they're trying to turn into the authoritarianism versus the democracy. And Modi is the same thing as Trump, is the same thing as Maduro. These just insane statements. But it's not the personalities. It's not the, paranoid style of politics or whatever. It really is the social system that undergirds it. So we could sit here and we could talk all day, but we're not going to do that. But of course, here on the Other Side podcast, we are here with you once a month. So we will be back to discuss much, much more again next month. But Ben, Manolo, as always, it was a pleasure to be
Top
alongside
button
you.
crew.
The Top Button crew.
Not all of us, but
well known.
yes.
Shout out to the people of Washington, D.C., who gave me this style. But either way, that is going to do it for us this time on the Other Side podcast here on Breakthrough News.